I'm Ridhima, and I'm so excited to be speaking for UXDX this morning. So, the topic for this session is going to be about designing for highly technical domains. And before we get started, a little bit about myself and why we are talking about this topic today. I've spent the last decade, almost last decade, designing for various products, working in various technical domains such as network security at Juniper, data visualization at Tableau, and now machine learning tools at Databricks. And through all these experiences, I found that designing for complex domains, although it's a very highly rewarding experience as a designer, but it can often feel very scary and frankly, almost uncomfortable territory for a lot of designers, especially when you've just joined a new team and you're working on an entirely new, highly technical domain, and you're expected to start designing experiences for users right away. Uh, while you're in that mode, you're also constantly being bombarded with terms that you have very little idea about. And you also don't have a good understanding at that point about your product or the ideal workflows of your users. And on top of all of this, you're also trying to build relationships with your stakeholders who probably may or may not have worked with designers before, right? So I think it can certainly feel like a lot for a lot of designers. And so, how can we as designers approach working in highly technical domains and harness the incredibly rewarding experience that it can be? So that's the discussion topic for today. But before we go deeper into how can we be successful as designers working in these complex domains, I want to take a minute to kind of talk about how do we even define complexity, and what are the parameters that make something complex. So, we all know when we see a complex application. So, example tools like Tableau for visualizing data, or there's this tool, Alberton, for music creation, or a tool like Blender for designing in 3D. But what makes something complex? If you kind of think about it, it can be hard to find the vocabulary to define what are the characteristics that make something complex. And so I try to dig deeper into like what is the definition of that. And it seems like, so according to Norman, complex applications are usually ones that operate in specialized domains or require specialized or technical knowledge, which can often take a while for users to develop. And in these cases, users are generally doing specialized tasks. And what's interesting is that usually you'll find users having very broad goals with not a single happy path, but rather several non-linear workflows to achieve something. So, for example, a 3D artist trying to create a 3D model of a house in Blender might want to do tasks in a different order depending on a variety of factors. But comparing that to something like a shopping experience at Amazon, where someone is more likely to search for an item, add it to their cart, and then go through the checkout process, that is a more linear workflow. So, the question is, how do you approach designing for complex domains that might be quite unfamiliar as a designer and scary? So that's going to be the focus of today's talk. So first, I'll share a little bit about how can some strategies that I found work well when you're trying to learn a new domain and you're trying to work in these complex domains. So I've rammed up on several highly technical domains in my career, and I've gathered some strategies that have worked well for me. So I'm going to share that with you. And in my experience, I found that the understanding the domain piece is probably the biggest roadblocks that I've seen designers run into. And unless we as designers kind of cross this hurdle, but it can be very hard to do truly impactful work in these organizations and operate at a more strategic level. So we'll spend a good chunk of time on this piece. Then we'll also look at some discovery practices that I found have worked well in my experience working in these organizations, especially when you might have limited access to users. And then lastly, we'll also deep dive into how can you build trust and strong communication with technical stakeholders. Again, some of whom may or may not have worked with designers before. So we have a lot of ground to cover. So we'll get started. So let's look into the first aspect, which is learning about the domain that you're designing for. So I think having observed from my experiences, having reflected on my experiences and observed several other designers working in these domains, I think I've observed that there are some common pitfalls that a lot of designers fall into. So one is that trying sometimes designers are trying to learn everything at once, so it can be very overwhelming, especially if you're new. There's a lot of resources out there. The other aspect is also, I think a lot of designers probably usually end up like learning a little bit overview of the domain in the beginning. So, but they kind of stop their learning from there, and they kind of get stuck at the surface level knowledge, which again is not very good in the long term. The other piece is, I think a lot of designers probably who have worked in this domain might, you know, resonate with this. Is that a lot of designers also constantly like pressure themselves that you have to be a domain expert to do good work, or which is, I think, absolutely not true, and we'll talk about it later. And then the last piece is that waiting for other people to create a learning path for you, which is not the right way for learning here, because I think in reality you have to design a learning path that works for you and takes into account what you already know, and what are your strengths and weaknesses that you want to focus on. So, as an example, when I first joined the machine learning team at Databricks, I joined with absolutely no experience in machine learning. And I remember being super uncomfortable and like an imposter in almost all the meetings that I went to. So, I was hearing all these terms, and I was expected to start working on two or three projects right away. And this was just about the domain, right? So, I also needed to learn about the users and the product. So how might one approach this learning? So I think in general, like when you are new to a domain and you're exposed to a lot of knowledge initially, I think the biggest piece is one to try to like build a more conceptual as a first step, build a more conceptual high level understanding of the key user workflows. So trying to understand what are users actually trying to achieve and what does success look like. So in the case of machine learning, it could be basically distilled down into the core components that people do: data preparation, they do training of machine learning models, they then put it into production, and then finally they want to monitor these models, and this cycle continues. So having that understanding and clarifying that really helps. And on top of that, then you can start tying the various concepts you're hearing about, and layer, and then I think it then starts making more sense. And I think what I found is that this framework really helped me in onboarding. So one was just understanding the concepts of the domain, but then on top of this, I could then layer user research findings for each part of the process, any product opportunities or gaps, etc., over this, which also further helped me deepen my understanding. So, I guess, so I think this is all great, but I think a common question is, okay, how do I even like get there? How do I even try to figure out how these various pieces fit together? Where do I even begin? A lot of people have that question. So I think it again like seems pretty obvious, right? To start your journey by taking notes, basic Googling, and even asking GPT now, which is like been very helpful as well, and noting down all the terms you're hearing and trying to find the definitions, and of course also taking some basic online courses. But where do you go from there? How do you build that intuitive and next level understanding of your users workflows and how they're using the product as well? And so I found a number of strategies that have worked really well for me and helped me onboard faster to a new domain. So I think like the first strategy I want to point out is playing with the product, and I think all of us designers, especially working in these domains, should take it very seriously. A lot of designers working in consumer products, it's very easy to kind of play with the product and you are sort of a customer. But in this case, I think try doing some tasks that your users would do in the product. Um, of course, some of them can be very technically challenging as well. So what I've usually found is either sit with a domain expert in the area and try to perform that task yourself, or follow along tutorials, or even observe someone doing the task. And I think that really helps give a lot more intuitive and understanding of the product and how people are using it. So at Databricks, there's this concept of critical user journeys. I think a couple of other companies also use that, where new hires go through and then document their process of going through a particular product feature with the team. So this is the first machine learning model that I created at Databricks. And this was maybe after 1 or 2 months of joining. And I still remember how illuminating that process was. I was immediately able to see so many product opportunities that would have been otherwise easy to miss if I had just spoken to users during interviews, for example. So playing with the product definitely builds a very strong intuitive understanding. And then when I documented my journey going through this process and I shared it with the rest of the company, um, even though when I was super new to the domain and super new to the company as well, there were several usability suggestions that I gave to the team, which were invaluable as well, which again don't really require you to have domain knowledge at that point, but helps you bring value as a designer right away. So the next method I'll call out is again more one-on-one discovery calls with users. I think we all know this, but I think it's important to call this out because sometimes we kind of wait to do discovery calls, a couple of months out when you've started a new job. But I think we need to spend time early and try to work with your PMs or other end stakeholders to have you observe some calls, even if you're not familiar with those topics. But just observe some calls, and you'll start hearing themes that kind of emerge through a lot of these calls. And during these calls, see if you can maybe take towards the end, ask a couple of questions about the nature of their work, their environment, their day-to-day tasks or responsibilities, which will also give you a little bit understanding of your users' environments and their workflows. Another mechanism that I found has worked very well when you are building that understanding of the domain is building relationships with SMEs in your organization. So can't stress this enough, but I found that you need to build your allies with people within the company. So SMEs who are passionate about your space and willing to share feedback, be the voice of the customer, and share with you, I think, this piece, right, which is the consolidated nuggets of wisdom of what's working and what's not working for users. So relationships with folks in these areas, in a couple of areas, right, like customer success, solution architects, or other SMEs, goes a long way in building your understanding. And you can, of course, reach out to them and get feedback on any concept you're exploring, or you have any questions about a particular part of the user's workflow or the product. And I think another mechanism, again, the fourth one, this comes naturally to us designers, but we need to remember to sometimes draw stuff out in meetings or even when learning. So it really helps to clarify your thinking and also be quite useful in bringing stakeholders on the same page. So, for example, this workflow was of a specific ML training process that I created along with my team, and it actually really helped save me and my team probably several days of back and forth as they were trying to explain to me the workflow and we were trying to get on the same page. This is a diagram from another colleague of mine at Databricks who ended up mapping the entire IA, information architecture of the product, and use that to map out the key user journeys of different users. And it was a great tool for anyone else joining the team for their onboarding, but it also helped people understand how various parts of the product relate to each other. So it helped um, bring to surface a lot of redundancies in the product that could be simplified further as well. And last technique that I would definitely like to call out is, one of the best ways to learn something is to share your learnings with others, and it's a forcing function for you to make sure your basics are correct, and helps you identify gaps in your knowledge as well. So even though you might not be an expert in the area, that's totally fine. There still will be people who will find your knowledge useful. And the more you share what you're learning, either by blogs, guides, or talks, the more cross pollination of ideas and knowledge occurs, and you'll build more opportunities for collaboration with other designers and PMs who might not be even in your immediate teams. So, as an example, about after 3 months of joining the ML team at Databricks, I, along with two other designers, gave this intro to ML presentation to the entire design team, and this got the entire design team thinking about ML and interested in that part of the product, which they were previously shy to deep dive into. So to summarize this first section, I just want to say that, even though you spend time in learning about the domain and you're putting in your efforts, there will always be something that you don't know, which will tend to make you uncomfortable and will bring a state of discomfort. But you need to remember that you don't need to be a domain expert in order to excel as a designer. Instead, you need to focus on your superpowers in being the voice of the user, and spend a lot of time in gaining solid understanding of your users, their motivations, their challenges. And again, bring your superpowers, right? Help your teams visualize your users' problems and their potential solutions. Um, and focus on learning in the long term. It's a long game when you're working in a particular domain, so don't be very hard on yourself as you're working towards this. So now that we've spent a little bit time learning about how to build a solid foundation of the domain, what kind of discovery practices can you use to strengthen your understanding of users, right? So I think it's important to discuss these discovery practices as, again, one of the big challenges that designers face in these domains is that getting access to users can be hard, as users might be strapped for time, or people might not be directly buying the product, but rather are going through elaborate sales cycles, right? So and again, I think another aspect to this is you will also notice that your product will have different types of users. So there'll be these power users who are the expert users, who are the evangelist for your product and use your product heavily. And they're most likely to provide you feedback. And usually these people tend to be more on the positive side as well because they already love your product. The other user type would be the professionals who might use your product for your day-to-day work, but can be a little bit hard to get access to. And they are the novice users who might still be the domain experts, but they have limited knowledge of your platform and need help in onboarding. So I think it's also important to figure out what's the mix of the users your platform supports, and what are the unique challenges that each group faces. So when you're talking to users, try to talk to a mix of these different user types so you get a broader perspective of the various users. So how do you have these customer conversations, and how do you get in touch with users? So again, like, one of the first things is leveraging these relationships that you've built with some of the SMEs, so with professional services or solution architects or sales engineers in your organizations. Usually I found like the best way to find these people is, at least our Databricks has been through Slack channels, or where I, like, let's say, share that, hey, I'm looking for feedback on a particular issue, and usually these people will be the first people to kind of respond, and then that kind of helps start building that initial relationship with these people. I think so. Another area, again, apart from regular research activities that you will probably be doing as a designer, such as usability testing or more generative research activities, I found that the single most illuminating research activity for me has been observing someone do a task, um, and giving them a prompt and really just observing them do how, like observing how they will go about finishing the task. So it could be either a user or an SME, if getting access to a user is hard. And I found this works really well because a lot of times when you're doing generative research, a lot of the nuances get lost in that, and it's hard for you as a designer to kind of really understand how a user is going about their workflow. So this kind of is more grounded in reality rather than hypothetical scenarios, and I think it really helps build that intuitive understanding of your users and their workflows. But again, one downside of it can be it can take a lot of time as well. So you'll have to kind of balance how many of these activities you do, versus like more using other research methods. And again, I think, because we are working in the constraint of like maybe where getting access to users can be hard, I think you have to be resourceful as a designer in these domains as well. So again, trying to get a more rounded perspective of your users. So looking at previous Jira tickets or bugs or previous research studies or like public reviews. And also I think playing with competitor products and having an understanding of their offerings also really helps, because it gives you an understanding of like what's out there, and how other people have been solving the same similar problems as well. So that's super helpful. And again, of course, like through all of this process, it's important to work closely with your cross-functional partners to stack rank these issues and help with prioritization, etc. So that's of course a given in this case where you are working with your cross-functional partners closely during this discovery exercises. So I guess then can I come to the last part of this section, which is about managing stakeholders. Um, so I think, again, a lot of designers run into unique, I would say, challenges with managing stakeholders in these, and working with stakeholders in these domains. Um, so one of them is that a lot of designers working in these domains are working with technical stakeholders who, again, may or may not have had the experience of involving designers in the product development process. So it may or may not be the case with you, but I think depending on that case, you might have to approach working with them differently. I think another challenge that I've seen designers run into is that it can be hard to push back when you are early in your learning process. But I think uh, I found some strategies that kind of help in that when you're just learning. So we'll dive into that as well. Um, and then I think it's also a harder road to build influence on the team, especially if the team is previously used to working without a designer. So all of this can be a little bit disheartening, and it can be hard and tiring as well to try to prove your value on the team, and it can be challenging for sure. But I think it's important to remember the purpose of your work and staying close to your users and keeping working towards making their lives easier, right? So, and I think, again, I stole this from Nielsen Norman in one of their presentations about working for technical domains. And I think they said that, it's important to remember that everything you do is making users' lives so much more better. And, I think it's important to keep a positive mindset and focus on the things that you can control. So I think like strategy number one, I would say is the big goal for you as a designer with stakeholders would be to build trust with them and show value as soon as you can, right? So uh, be intentional with showing value and building trust. So, for example, make sure that you share out broadly any customer interviews that you've done, insights you've gathered, prototypes you've created via Loom videos or whatever, and not just with the internal teams that you work with, but also your broader orgs. share resources on design with the teams to help elevate their understanding as well of how design can be useful for the product. Um, and one thing that I've kind of tried to do is, we have a quarterly all hands, and where sometimes I try to like share some of the design work over there that we are doing. So it helps in more people being aware of the incredible work that you bring as a designer, and the value you bring to the team. And I think that the more value you show, the more trust it builds with the teams as well. Um, I think the other piece, it goes without saying, is that you have to understand the business as well. And I think in these particular like complex domains, um, again, if you want to operate at a more strategic level, of course, understanding the domain is one piece, but again, you have to learn about the domain. So of the business. So where does the money come from? Which are the whale customers, or quote unquote the big customers? What are their biggest asks, and what are the biggest gaps and opportunities on the platform that they are asking for? So it's important to be aware of them and keep an ear open for that. And again, this of course will be you'll be enabled to having an understanding of the business will help you connect with the higher ups much easily uh, when you're able to understand the business and speak to it on top of your domain as well. And I think again, the biggest I think advantage to designers is that we can help teams and individuals see the product more horizontally, and we can be the connective tissue that can connect various teams and products together. So we should definitely like this is another mechanism to kind of show value to the team and really help the teams try to simplify a lot of the workflows that they might be thinking about or designing. So, for example, at Databricks, like one of the things we observe is that sometimes various teams are kind of building similar functionality, and they might not be aware that they're doing that. So as designers, sometimes we kind of get to know about that early through our design shares and some of the design in progress design work that we share with each other. And so a lot of times I've seen that designers end up, you know like setting calls between various teams and have them talk about, hey, like how can we kind of simplify these use cases a little bit more, and maybe we don't duplicate the user experience in the product. So I think that can really help. And I think being the connective tissue also helps in building more reusable patterns in the team. So I think that's where designers can also really help in these domains. And I think like another thing, last thing I would say about this is that I think sometimes a lot of these teams want to involve designers and often hear from other companies that involving designers is important, but they might not, some stakeholders might not know even like what that looks like in practice. So, depending on the majority of the organization and the majority of your relationship with that stakeholder, you might want to share some artifacts that designers produce, or like how to best involve them, educate them as to how you would like to work with them and what's the ideal working process. And you'd be probably surprised by how much these activities can turn out to be transformative in the team. So I would say again, like also like spend time in doing retros occasionally, and keep giving them feedback. Let them know what's the best way to make the relationship work better, and be open to feedback from them as well. So yeah, I know I talked a lot today, and I hope this was useful. But just to summarize what we kind of learned today is that, you know, complex applications again usually operate in specialized domains, and these domains where users probably have broad and non-linear workflows. Uh, as a designer, when you're working in these domains, you need to spend a lot of time about three aspects. So one is the domain, the second is the users and your product, and you have to spend time. You have to be intentional in creating a learning path for all these three areas. um, the other piece is that as a designer, working in these domains. It's a myth. You don't need to be a domain expert, and it can be very scary as well. Trying to be a expert in a very short amount of time, it's just not possible. But you need to focus on your superpowers to be the voice of the user, um, and help the team visualize concepts. And lastly, you need to build trust, understand the business, and again, focus on your superpowers to be the connective tissue in the organization as well. So yeah, and yeah, that's it for me. And thank you very much.